we have only 4 main producing sectors: tourism, manufacturing, agriculture, and most recently, mining. That's the oil production we have. Because of the small size of our domestic economy, production in volume sufficiently large to yield economies of scale require that we produce for export. We can't consume what we produce because we produce too much of any single commodity. And again, because of our small size, there is a limit to the number of scale economic operations in which we can engage. We just do not have the resources, volume, or the capital with which to develop them. And we have problems with our environment in attracting large amounts of foreign direct investment. You may wish to go to the World Bank website, again, easily available via Google, and have a look at their latest assessment of the issues involved in doing business with Belize. This was published last week. Low overall income and unequal income distribution, as I indicated earlier, lead to significant poverty. Since in terms of numbers, poor people have more clout than those that are not poor, it is inevitable that in a one-man, one-vote political democratic system, such as the one we operate, governments will at least pay lip service to the notion of development, defined in terms of expanding the level of economic activity and incomes in order to raise the living levels of everyone, with a concentration on improving the lifestyles of poor people, so that economic growth, income redistribution, and the provision of social services with a focus on basics become important parts of government policy. In small countries, what happens, of course, is that high-end skills are not generally in high demand, with a consequential limitation on the personal development opportunities of individuals who wish to remain in the economy. Although I should note here that thankfully this situation is changing, at least in some areas, where cheap and easy air transport and telecommuting facilitates global or at least regional participation in the knowledge segments of economies. Inevitably, of course, governments from time to time overreach themselves and try to provide facilities and services beyond their financial capacities. In other words, they spend more than they have. They can do this in 2 ways. They can borrow beyond their debt servicing capacity, or they can create domestic purchasing power beyond the capacity of an economy to sustain. Belize has had a recent history of both sets of activities, and we are currently living with the legacy of those actions. I'm not here going to go into the issue of whether the resources that were raised were properly utilized. That is for another time and place. The point I want to make is that 2 things happened. The first is that government borrowed from private lenders, mainly banks, so much that we found ourselves unable to meet the interest and loan repayment obligations. We had to negotiate a restructuring of the debts, and this involved private lenders agreeing to take a cut in the outstanding amounts and to lower interest rates so that we pay lower rates now and higher rates later when presumably we can afford them. This obviously has implications for current and forthcoming government budgets because of the need to set aside resources to meet higher interest payments and the final repayment obligations in respect of money that has already been spent. Setting aside resources obviously means that current spending will need to be curtailed. The second thing you need to note is that the level of government borrowing from the central bank, otherwise known as printing money, was at such a level as to result in a depletion of the official foreign exchange reserves of the country. This then forced the central bank to restrict credit to the entire economy in order to defend the exchange rate. This restriction took the form of high reserve requirements for the commercial banks in order to limit their ability to lend, and high interest rates to discourage borrowing by the private business sector and households. Until these reserves are built back up to comfortable levels, this policy stance has to be maintained. It involves strict limits on government spending that is not financed by revenue or inflows from abroad, preferably grants rather than loans. and if loans then soft loans. And it requires a tight money stance. As an aside or a consequence of this, a domestic stimulus package to counter the effects on Belize of recession in the U.S. and our main trading partners can only work effectively if it is financed by external foreign currency inflows. And a great deal of effort is currently going into the raising of concessional and semi-concessional inflows from abroad. This leads to another feature of our economic reality: heavy dependence on external support, both grants and loans. The preliminary identified budget financing gap mentioned yesterday by the Prime Minister at the Budget Symposium at the Radisson Hotel reflects a desire to maintain last year's level of government spending into next year's, in the face of what could be a sharp decline in grant inflows from Taiwan and Venezuela. Since any considerable resort to central bank financing is not on because of the adverse effects on our foreign reserves, the remaining options are additional external revenue support, higher taxes, and this is always a difficult issue, particularly now in the face of already declining disposable incomes as a result of the global recession, greater efficiency and effectiveness in tax assessment and collections, and the room to do this here has to be huge, given the institutional developments that have been taking place with what I call corruption creep, or a cut in government spending. Fiscal and monetary management is not rocket science. I would ask you to beware of so-called financial whiz kids. When they are around, keep a tight grip on your wallet. I want to conclude by putting in a nutshell the advice I used to give the public sector economic managers in the 17 borrowing members of the Caribbean Development Bank, including the managers in Belize. Although I must confess that here, the advice fell on stony ground. You start with a realistic and factual assessment of the current situation and prospects of your economy. And you do it in writing so that everybody sings off the same hymn sheet. You identify the main issues, challenges, and constraints in sufficient detail that you can determine whether they can be successfully addressed and how. What are the development objectives over the next 5, 10, 20 years? Note that as the time horizon is shortened, the objectives need to become very clear and very specific, because you can only do specific things. You can't do things in general. Yeah. You realize high-level objectives by successfully completing lower-level tasks. What you want the society and the economy to look like, economically, socially, and politically, is extremely important, since these three aspects are inextricably intertwined. You need to identify the threats and the opportunities that you can see and foresee. What are the specific things that can be done to address the issues, challenges, constraints, and threats? What can be done to take advantage of the opportunities in moving forward to achieve the development objectives? And since everything can't be done at once, how will the individual projects be prioritized? What factors need to be taken into consideration? What do your annual capital and recurrent budgets look like for the next 3 to 5 years when you have completed this process, making the appropriate allowances for contingencies? We will get natural disasters. We don't know what form the disasters will take, but we will get them, so we have to plan for them. Finally, I would like you to note that this entire presentation has been based on the production of goods, production of services, and of mined products is an entirely different matter. And here is where I think our future lies, not as a substitute for goods, but integrated with goods production. Tourism already is a case in point. Production flexibility is there in mined products. Products can much more easily be marketed and hyped, and product innovation and prices are limited only by the inventiveness of the product creator. Significant effort is, however, required to develop our human resources capacity, not least the capacity to conceptualize the possibilities and to undertake the mammoth task that is required to restructure our entire approach to education and training. Thank you.